I'm Jonathan.
And this is the podcast where we watch The Tudors after almost 10 years and go into depth on the history and background of the show, explaining the stories behind the drama. Learn more about the show and about us at watchingthetudors.com. This is episode 3. Wolsey, Wolsey, Wolsey. A quick reminder that if you like the show and want to see more of it, please give us a rating on iTunes. It's the number one way you can help a show succeed because it helps other people find the program. Let me talk about the reason why we're doing this quickly and our Tudor cred. So I'm Heather, and I started the Renaissance English History podcast in 2009, 2 years after the Tudors premiered. And it's still running, and if you want to get into even more depth, you can check it out at englandcast.com. I thought it would be fun to go through and start watching the Tudors from the beginning again after almost 10 years and see what stuck out after learning and podcasting about this period for such a long time. And it's my goal to bring the stories behind the Tudors to life in a more accessible way for the average viewer, and hopefully people will want to go even deeper and check out the other podcast as well.
And I'm Jonathan, and I always hear my wife talking about historical English stuff that I know basically nothing about, and I always hear these names of kings and stuff like that. And I thought this would be a good way to sort of learn a little bit about this subject that she finds so interesting. I figured there's got to be some reason she's so into it.
Are you getting interested in it at all?
Yeah. Three shows in, and I can see what the interest is.
What the appeal is?
Yeah.
Cool.
I can't say it's really, my thing, but I get why people are into it. I mean, I do, and I do want to find out what's going to happen. And
it's not just about the drama.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's historical. I mean,
okay.
Most of it really happened, and I mean, it's also about the significance. I mean, it sort of affected the way the world works. I mean, at least the Western world, which everything has ripple effects. And
look at you.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been so into history as I am just 3 shows into a Showtime produced show. So there you go, the power of television. And also my part in the podcast is to sort of represent the historical layman who don't necessarily know all the details. We just know sort of what they show us. So
rock on.
Yeah, I hope the other people who aren't history buffs can understand a little more or sort of get a little more into it from my perspective.
So we'll do a quick recap, and then you'll ask me questions.
Yes, I will. I have a whole list.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, it's the longest list I've had so far. So.
Oh God! All right.
It's this stuff is fast moving. I can't believe it's soaked with drama and historical amazingness.
Wow. So, spoiler alert: this whole series assumes that you have watched the episode or you're rewatching it with us. If you haven't, please stop and watch the episode if you don't want to have spoilers. So we're going to be talking about everything that happened.
And also, as I always point out, we may have sort of spoilers in the future, historical, larger themes that happened. Like Wolsey becoming more important in his role and things like that.
Like Anne Boleyn dies.
Yeah, spoiler alert, Anne Boleyn dies. We've some of those things we'd think you would know or something, or it wouldn't put you off too much. So
yeah. So the recap of episode 3, Wolsey, Wolsey, Wolsey. It originally aired in April 2007. So we see more people trying to bring down Wolsey. It's like a common theme is that Wolsey's kind of up there with people trying to knock him down. Also, the young gentlemen of Henry's court are feeling a bit left out at all the honors being given to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Anne Boleyn seems to be catching Henry's attention. She's driven on by her father and uncle in this quest to bring some power back to the old families of England and talk some shit about Wolsey. And also the Emperor, Charles V, comes to England and he signs a peace treaty, and little Princess Mary is betrothed to him despite a rather large age difference, which was not unusual. Catherine of Aragon confides in her nephew that she's feeling a tad bit uneasy about her marriage, and she's actually afraid that Henry's going to ask her for a divorce. And he responds that he is always going to support her and she can count on his loyalty all the time. And speaking of loyalty, Thomas More gives some feedback to Henry on an anti-Lutheran pamphlet that he's writing to send to the Pope, and has authorized him, More, to burn a bunch of heretical books, which is proof that real life is often more ironic than fiction, because that part is actually all true. And how things would change in just 10 or 15 years. Poor Henry and his relationship with the Pope. Also, Henry's sister in the show, we see this sister called Margaret. She's marrying the King of Portugal. And it really pains me to say this because I don't understand why they had to change her name. And I understand why they had to make it Portugal for the show, but it's that part's just so dramatically licensed, and it just kind of makes my head hurt. But that's what happens in the show, so there we go. You want to start asking questions now?
Sure.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, so the whole thing, this episode started off with like a play that they were practicing.
Mask.
So, okay, so it's called a mask.
A mask.
Okay.
Yes.
And the guy sort of organizing it, putting it on, was Cornish. Mm-hmm. That's William Cornish, I guess.
Yes.
And who is he someone? Like, is he a...
He was a composer, and he put on masks, and he was actually largely responsible for the events, the pageantry of the Field of Cloth of Gold. And there was just a lot of pageant. That's very common in court life, is to have pageants. So, you'd have like an impresario, or a person who would put together the dances and the scenery and all that kind of stuff. And that actually continues, that we have the theater at Elizabethan theater and Shakespeare. But even past that, in the Stuart Kings, we're looking 100 years on, there's a very famous guy called Inigo Jones, who was an architect. But one of the big ways that he got famous was putting on masks, designing the sets and things like that for masks for King James I, his wife, Anne of Denmark. And so this is a role that is in court life ongoingly.
Cool. So it's kind of like producers, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And later on, he got like money from
Thomas
Boleyn, because he put Anne in his mask or whatever, up in the good place. Cool. Okay. So you alluded to this, but Sister Margaret is not really, like, the king had a sister, but she I just don't really know why they had to do this.
Why they had to change her name. So Henry had two sisters at this point. Margaret. There was a Princess Margaret, and she was married off into Scotland. So her lineage actually is what became the Stuart Kings and succeeded after Elizabeth died. Mm-hmm. And that was through her line. But he had another sister, Mary. Now, this whole story with the marrying this old king, it did happen. It was France. And it was before I understand in the timeline here, because they were just in France with a Field of Cloth of Gold last time, it wouldn't have really worked. But in real life, Princess Mary was married to the French king, and he was 30 years older than her, and she was very distraught at it. And there is this idea that she told him she would go ahead and do it. And it was this informal promise he made her that if the king died, she could remarry who she wanted to for love, and that. So it's just, he did have a Margaret, Princess Margaret. She was in Scotland, and there was Mary went to France.
Gosh, why do they have to name everyone the same name?
They were really unoriginal.
And there's some new Thomases in this
of course
episode as well. So Marys and Thomases.
Yes.
All right. So Margaret was not marrying the King of Portugal. That's just... And then Charles Brandon, is it? Mm-hmm. So he was made Duke of Suffolk.
Yes.
And that's, like, this is a real guy. Charles Brandon is a real guy, and he was really made Duke of Suffolk.
Yeah, he was one of the, he became Henry's really close BFF. He was a gentleman. I think his father... I'd have to look this up. Let me look it up quick. I think his father was the standard bearer for Henry VII. And so he was fighting that right there next to Henry VII in Bosworth Field. And so that's Charles. I think his father died, actually.
Yeah.
And yeah, he was the standard bearer for Henry Tudor. That's who his father was.
His father was buddies with his dad. That was Henry's dad.
Yeah. And so Charles Brandon grew up in the court and became BFFs with Henry, but he wasn't, born from an old
nobility.
Yeah, exactly.
So, the king asked Charles something like, "Oh, so you're married to Elizabeth Grey now? Like or who you married to? It's hard to keep track of who all you're married to," kind of thing. And you were saying, like you mentioned to me that Charles Brandon was married to his sister, Henry's sister.
Well, yeah. So because she goes off to Portugal in the story, but in real life she went to France and married the French king, and he died after like 6 months. And Charles Brandon went to retrieve her to bring her back to England, and they fell in love and they got married. And they got married without asking Henry for permission, which was illegal at the I think it became a law out of what she did. But you pretty much, if you had a claim to the throne, you had to get permission from the king, because it was a diplomatic thing at that point.
So it was kind of like foreshadowing with him saying, "Can't I trust, you
can't trust me.
I can trust you with my sister." And he's like, "Oh, are you sure?" Wink, wink. Because he's going to end up marrying her.
Clever.
He's marrying the other one because Margaret. All right. Well, good stuff, Charles Brandon.
It pains me to say Margaret because I really want to say Mary. Margaret Mary.
Because
Margaret's in Scotland.
Yeah.
Why did they do that?
All right. So moving on. So the emperor, who is also the king of Spain.
Yes.
And the nephew of the Queen of England.
I have a little bit more information on his lineage, like just from other stuff I've been reading just separately, but go on.
Okay. So they were talking about like Lutheranism spreading from Germany into Spain and how he was suppressing it.
Yes.
Like, I mean, that was going on. Like Lutheranism was spreading.
This is the height
sort of around the time.
The Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Fear and surprise. And almost fanatical. What is it? Anyway, yes, this was the height of the Spanish Inquisition. And so,
so that's what the Spanish, I mean.
Yeah. No, that's what the Spanish Inquisition was to root out all of this heretical stuff going on.
I see. So with the guys with the hats and stuff were coming around and being like, "Do you like this guy, Martin Luther?" And if you said, "Sure, I do," they'd like kill you. And even if you said, "No, I don't," they
would like
anyways.
Search your house to see if you had any heretical texts, and they would look and see if you were, going to the mass regularly. Did you ever associate with people who were known to be reformers? What was, did you ever miss mass? All that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And so
that was what was going on in Spain at the time.
So Charles was sort of at the head of the Inquisition, or did he start it?
Well, actually, no. Queen Isabella of Ferdinand and Isabella was the first one to introduce the Inquisition into Spain. And the thing is, though, what put Charles in a weird position was that he was also the heir to the Habsburg family, which was in Germany. So and that's where Lutheranism spread in the German states. And so, he had this weird relationship going on where he had these lands where it was like really flowering and was really ripe for...
Yeah, so he's, kind of conflicted with his different obligations.
But he was, Spanish at heart, and his mother was Spanish.
And he was also the Roman emperor. Right. So, I mean, he would have been behind, like, Rome and Catholicism,
in theory, he was later going to sack Rome, but yeah.
Yeah, it's all nothing's that clean in all of this, really, is it?
No.
Everyone's related to everyone.
Exactly.
All right. Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about that later. So, and then the king was also against the Protestant movement, as is later shown by like his letter or whatever condemning.
He wrote a pamphlet in real life, condemning it, and that's how he got the title Defender of the Faith, which monarchs still use in their official titles today.
Because he was so defensive of
the faith.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then they talked about a new treaty between like the delegates or whoever they were came from Spain, and they were and then they signed it at the end. Like that was a real thing. Like
and the timing again is weird because they actually in real life met up right before the Field of Cloth of Gold. So Charles actually came to England like a week before they went to the Field of Cloth of Gold
to sign the treaty.
French treaty. Yeah,
so they were just signing treaties right and left.
Yes, they were.
Good times. Mm-hmm. But that really was so that was a thing.
Yeah, and Henry tried to work with Charles to beat the French,
whom he signed a treaty with a week later.
Exactly, and they decided
that's just details, right?
Yeah, details. Yep. Yeah.
All right, and then I'm confused. So Charles was to marry Mary.
Yes.
And was this? That was a real thing?
Yeah, they talk about how there's a report of how sweet she was because she was playing the virginals, which was like an early keyboard, and she came in and spoke such good Latin,
and this was when they met for the treaty. Mm-hmm. But then, how was she also supposedly married away to the French thing, or was that just? I don't know how that all worked together. I know that there's a report of her having impressed Charles so much with her playing of the virginals, and she was about 8 at the time, and I'm not exactly 100% sure that was at that. Yeah, it would have been at that same meeting. So they were just they were just marrying her to everyone. Yeah. So it's sort of like the treaties. It's like they're just signing treaties right and left, and they're marrying off Mary. The problem when you only have one daughter and you're trying to be diplomatic with people. Yeah. See, this is why you want to have a lot of children. So you can just marry them off all over the place. And it doesn't, You can throw them around like treaties. Exactly. Okay. Yeah. Oh, man. And then again, and I guess this is sort of creative license with the Pope thing, like how the Spanish were now promising to support Wolsey for Pope. Like everyone's supporting Wolsey for Pope, and that's just, there's no record of him. I mean, I think Wolsey would have liked it, but there wasn't, at this point in time where they're at here, there wasn't an opportunity. There wasn't a dead Pope. Okay. So that's probably somewhat fictitious. Right. Everyone supporting him for Pope. I mean, they're collapsing several years in different episodes here. Okay. So at this point where we are in the story, there wouldn't have been an opportunity for him to have been the Pope. Okay. Now the niece of Norfolk. It sounds like a dirty word. It's my good accent. That was Anne Boleyn? Yes. Okay. So were they like brother? Was Thomas Boleyn and the Norfolk guy related, Thomas Boleyn was married to Norfolk's sister. Yes. Okay. And then so the Duke of Norfolk was saying, like, yeah, we got to get her in there so she can denounce Wolsey. Right. And like, why? Like, because everyone hates it. Like, why would she do that? I mean, just because Dad was telling her, but why does he? Like, I don't know. Well, there's this whole thing where nobody likes the fact that Henry's brought in all these new men, and there's still this. Remember we talked about last time, like the Wars of the Roses, and there's still these long-standing feuds between families that they want to. And Wolsey's the son of a butcher, so they're like, this damn son of a butcher is basically running England. Yep, and we don't like this. And like, we're supposed to be the important ones, so they're just. He's not even counseling with us about what we. Yeah, he's just doing his own thing. He's trying to become the Pope. Exactly. Or whatever. Yes. And building like huge castles for himself, palaces. Mm-hmm. And we're just left like with our old land and like no say in anything. Right. I can see why they didn't like the guy. Yeah. No. Okay. Now people hated him. It's all starting to come together for me. There you go. Yeah, I'm getting it. Okay, so that's sort of one of her jobs, is to get in there and denounce Wolsey. Right. Okay, and then the Mask, I guess, the play, The Mask, like that's I know you weren't there to watch it and they don't have videos, but that's sort of something they would do, like things like that, like
And
little sort of funny plays. Masks.
No, that was fun. You've got long evenings, and what are you going to do? There's no TV, so you would put on plays and things like that, dancing and working things out. And in real life, there is this legend that Henry and Anne met. She was Perseverance, and it was a mask that was similar to what had happened.
Okay, so that's sort of so that was sort of historically based.
Yeah, that's the story supposedly of how he was first attracted to her.
That's cute.
Yeah.
And I was sort of wondering, he sort of met her and kind of was captured,
enraptured.
Enraptured is the word, I guess. Never used that word, by her. And I thought she was one of his later wives. Like she was
his second wife.
His second wife. So after all of this was going on, like all the meetings and everything that was going on in Whitehall. Yes,
Whitehall. Various palaces around the court. Like I said, once before would move from place to place. So now Henry has Hampton Court. In real life, I don't think he had it yet at this point, but
in the story, he was given it by Wolsey. Okay, so it's one of those places.
There was also the Palace of Sheen, there was Richmond, there was Greenwich. There were a whole bunch of, different palaces that they would move from place to place. And especially in the summer months when there was plague, they would get out of the city.
I see.
So they would move around. And each place had offices set up. And, you would send people ahead to make it all perfect, so you just kind of show up. And
these were all in the general area of London, what we know now as London?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, from Greenwich over to Richmond is where Hampton Court and Sheen was. And
so I don't know where those places are. They're all around
it's all around
the general London area.
Yeah, villages outside of London. And then Whitehall, of course, was right in Westminster, right in London. And they were all, the big thing is they were all along the river, so it was easy to get to them.
I see. So they could just float all the people and the supplies up. And
it was a lot easier to move things around if you were along the river.
I see.
And they would go, I'm not sure particularly here, but they would go to Windsor as well, was popular. And an interesting fact, Windsor is actually the oldest continuously inhabited castle in the world.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So Windsor was another one along the river, was popular.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. And then they were talking about the war. I guess Wolsey and the king, or someone in the king.
Yeah.
Was talking about the war, and he said, I want a new...
Warship.
Yeah. He said, I have the victory, or I guess it was Wolsey said, but sir, the victory's just being launched. You want it? And he says, well, I want another one.
Yeah.
Like, what was that, like, really a thing? Like, was he building a big navy back then?
He's very famous for having built the Tudor Navy. So I'm going to do a plug for my podcast here. I just did about 4 episodes in January of 2015, 2016, on the rise of the Tudor Navy. And so the one thing is, when Henry VII took the throne, I think there were 3 ships in the Tudor Navy, in the English Navy, which is, kind of funny considering it's an island nation. And most people at that time, even fishermen, never went out of sight of land. So, they didn't need these big warships, but it's an island. They should have a navy. Yeah. And so Henry VII...
Because, like, the Spanish and the Portuguese had huge navies, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, they were sailing across... Yeah. And it just was, there's a lot of changes that were going on at this time with boats and technology, and people can listen to my podcast for information on that. But briefly, Henry VII built the first dry dock at Portsmouth, and he started building the Navy up a bit. And then he also was famous for being miserly in a way, and he left Henry VIII a large fortune. And Henry saw boats, they were like toys for him, like if you had somebody now saw planes or something like that, right? And so he built the Mary Rose, was one of the first ones. He also built the Henri Grossadou, was a very famous one as well. That he tried to take it to the Field of Cloth of Gold, and I think it was like there wasn't a port that was deep enough for it to be able to.
So he couldn't get it there.
It was so big, so
Yeah.
he couldn't actually get it there. He wanted to show it off,
Oh,
and there was one of it might have been that, I forget exactly which one, but the Scots at the same time were very jealous and were trying to build up their navy, and I think one of these ships they bought it from him to make it their own, and then it wound up sinking, and I don't know, it was just a story. But yeah, people can listen to my podcast for lots of information on the Tudor Navy.
Cool.
Yeah.
So it showed him shooting a gun, like a rifle, when he was talking about this and stuff, and it had me think, like, were there, you said that guns were sort of coming around at this time. Were there cannons on the big boats and stuff?
Yeah, that was one of the big things that was one of these big technologies, was the side, there was a way that they were putting shingles on the sides of the boat that allowed for these big holes that the cannons would come out of. And the Henri Grossadou and the Mary Rose both had side guns. And also it was interesting because it allowed for naval warfare. It was very different than what had ever been fought before. And these changes in technology in the Spanish and Portuguese did not have these same types. It was clapboard, and it was it was a more Northern European way of building ships. And it's one of the things with the Spanish Armada 50, 60 years after this time, 70 years, that the Spanish wanted the whole technique of warfare, naval warfare before, was grappling, throwing the hook over, and then boarding. And because the English had these ships that could shoot from the side, they could stay much further away and they could shoot at them from the side, and they didn't have to go in a tight formation and try and grapple and stuff. It also, though, sadly meant that a lot of times things went really bonky, and there was one of these early battles with France. There was a story of somebody, the cannon blew up and the whole ship sank, and it was like their ship.
Well, I can just imagine all the gunpowder they would have stored, and I bet, and they didn't have fireproof containers and stuff back then. So
so there were a lot of mishaps early on.
Yeah,
but
lots of opportunity for bad things to happen.
Yeah, but as they perfected it, they were able to become the leading naval power in the world, and that was in part because of this early bit of technology that allowed for these holes and the cannons to go on. Yeah.
And then, so later, Thomas Boleyn, is that his name? He became a knight, the Knight of the Garter. Yeah. And he really did become...
Probably, I mean, I would, The Knight of the Garter was an exclusive... I think it still exists today, an exclusive group of knights, and there was a big ceremony, and it was quite mystical.
And he was just doing that because he wanted
his daughter,
the king. Okay. And he also said he's in control of the household.
He was the comptroller.
Comptroller.
Yeah, and that's something that still exists in companies today. Okay, it's the person who manages, it's like a financial position where you manage the income. It's like a...
Okay, so
I'm not a professional at knowing, but you run the money of that.
This isn't your forte of knowledge, but
it has to do with
more than I do.
Money of the household.
I didn't know comptroller was a word, so there you go. You know more than I do.
It is.
And then Anne was to become. So he said, "Oh, and by the way, your daughter, she's neat." And he said, "Oh yes, she's going to be a lady in waiting."
Yes.
What's a lady in waiting? Is that like you just waited around for the king to want to hook up with you? Or?
Hannah's so into Robin Hood right now, the Disney one. Yeah. And there's the scene where Maid Marian is playing tennis with Lady Cluck.
Yes.
And she's like, "As your lady in waiting, I'm waiting." Right? Yes. That always cracks me up. Anyway.
I'm glad that's one of your favorite jokes of that movie.
It is. No, a lady in waiting was the queens would have their ladies who would dress them, and I
saw them brushing her hair at the end.
Exactly. And
so that's what they were.
Yeah, and it was an important place for women if you could get a place in the household of the queen. it was an important thing to be able to have because you could have advancement. You were living at court then, and that's how, what Anne Boleyn was doing in France. She was with the French court. And so it was a really lucky thing if you could get your daughter.
So a lady in waiting is like a servant of the queen.
Yeah, she would keep the queen company, and she was basically like the queen's friends, and she'd do good. Yeah.
Okay. I would call that like a servant. But
yeah.
Okay. And then you could maybe meet a duke.
Exactly.
And get married into something or something.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
And also the other thing is, even if you were married, your husband might be somebody in the court, and then you would be in the court as a lady in waiting too. So it wasn't necessarily for single women who wanted to find husbands.
No, I just meant that might be one option. Or...
It might be, indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just hobnobbing with the
and it
royalty.
also was something that people did even not on a royal level. So there's a famous noblewoman called Bess of Hardwicke, and she went away at age 12, 14, something like that, to another nobleman's house where she served that nobleman as a lady in waiting equivalent to that house. So even though they weren't the queen, if you could get something a couple of steps up from you socially, it was good for you because it would also teach you how to run a household, and hopefully that family could introduce you to people and stuff like that. So it wasn't just queens that had ladies in waiting, although that was like the big deal if you could get that job.
Okay.
Yeah, because then you'd see the king.
So it's, like in my head, it's like this big female servant thing.
Yeah, sure.
So females would go off to serve other females in higher statues then?
And they'd learn about running a household. They'd learn the woman was charged. It wasn't just a one-way street of them serving. The woman who you were in her household, she basically treated you like a daughter and would try and arrange a good marriage for you. It was a two-way reciprocal sort of. She would teach you. You would go to school, as much schooling as you could have, but you would, learn things in that household. And
I get it.
And so, it was, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Servant makes it sound so like they're sleeping in the fire with the ashes.
No,
like
I don't mean
Cinderella.
like a slave. It's just like they would like do what the people would tell. I mean, they were sort of, it was their boss.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. For sure. Yeah.
So they were in the employ kind of, and the other person, and they wouldn't necessarily get paid. They would get things, but they wouldn't necessarily make like a wage or something.
Right.
So in my head, that's a servant. But
yeah, it's just
good.
it leads us into this whole discussion of like 16th century economy and pre-modern economies where you don't have like money being exchanged for things, but it's more like patronage. And it's just, I don't know. When I think servant, I think of like somebody who's, receiving a wage for work that they do, and it's their boss, and it's like a very one-way relationship. And this was a much more...
I just think a servant serves the person that they're a servant of.
Cool.
All right. Thomas Wyatt.
Yeah.
He was like Anne Boleyn's boyfriend or something.
Thomas Wyatt was a poet. He was married at the time. There was still this whole courtly love thing that would go on. And courtly love was introduced through the Eleanor of Aquitaine, and early on that's in like the 12th century. And it was this whole idea that you would pick a lady to serve her, and you would raise her up, and she could be married or whatever, and you would be her knight. And, it was this whole Arthur and Guinevere and the courtly love thing. And I think Henry himself, you can tell early on, really followed that idea of courtly love, and he wanted to try to bring back some of the romance of medieval courts with this whole thing. And he would write these passionate letters and say he was, even with Anne Boleyn, he would say, "I'm your servant," and all these kind of things going back to that. And Thomas Wyatt, being a poet, probably saw a lot of that. Now, later on, Thomas Wyatt would be implicated in Anne Boleyn's downfall. There were rumors that there was a pre-contract with them, or, that she had slept with him before, and, whatever. And he was put in the Tower, and he is one of the only ones, I think he was the only one, an Anne Boleyn expert would know this, but to not actually be killed of all of the people who were accused with her, including her brother and, all of the people who were accused with her when she was falling. And he was not killed, but there's a very famous poem that he wrote when he was in the tower that is his most famous piece about these dark days have broken my heart, and seeing all these, because he was watching all these executions. And yeah, I also did an episode on Tudor poets, and he's mentioned in there. So
nice.
Look at that little plug for my podcast.
Well, this is all the stuff you like.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's Thomas Wyatt. I don't know that I think that if they would have actually had more than they did, it would have come out in her trial. But
so whatever.
Who knows?
Okay. And I mean, he was a real person. He was connected with Anne Boleyn.
And I think he did indeed. I think he loved her more than she loved him.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he said that he was going to get a divorce and he was separated. Like, is that something they did back then? Was like people got divorced and stuff? And
yeah, you could arrange for annulments. There wasn't so much.
I mean, they might not have called it divorce,
yeah.
but people. I mean, I thought back then you just got married and that was it. Or
if you had money, you could do anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, and then Henry. So then Henry was writing his letter against Protestantism. Is that the word? Mm-hmm. Okay. And you said that's ironic, or
yes,
because like he went on to
found the Church of England,
be a Protestant founder, or like, I mean,
yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, so this goes way deep into Henry's psyche and whatever. Henry never actually was a Protestant, even until his dying day. He maintained Catholic rights. So up until he died, I mean, one of the very last people who was burned at the stake was Anne Askew, and she was a Protestant martyr that Henry burned in 1546. And so he never was actually a Protestant in terms of, he still believed in transubstantiation, which is that when you take communion, the wafer actually is Christ. It was a big tenet of Protestantism, or of Protestants said it's symbolic. It's not actually real. And Henry said, you got to believe that it's real. That was a really big thing for him. And just in terms of saying the Mass, he didn't want the Bible to be in English. He didn't want all of these things.
The whole thing that he founded the Church of England, because he did found the Church of England, is kind of ironic, because he kind of considered, like, he's just kind of ironic with the whole religious thing.
The whole thing is ironic for him, yeah.
He's super Catholic.
Yeah, he never actually supported the Protestants at all. He just didn't want to. He just wanted the divorce. Pope. Yeah, he didn't want the Pope telling him what to do, which was not unique for English kings. English kings, people,
even though he probably still thought he was like the direct connection to God,
right?
He just didn't like people telling him what to do.
Right. Exactly. Well, now I think he thought that he was this is the whole thing. Like, people think Henry was the first one to argue with the Pope. And English kings from the beginning of time argued with the Pope, because it was the whole idea that he was like in Rome, and what right
to
did
tell him about how to do anything with
his
England
kingdom. And also, by this time, the church was so powerful and had so much land, they didn't have to pay taxes on their land. You see how powerful they can become with Wolsey, and the church had so much money, and Henry ultimately wanted to get his hands on that money, and that's why the next Thomas we're going to meet likely is going to be Cromwell, and he's going to mastermind the dissolution of the monasteries and giving all that money to Henry, with which he will use it to build more ships and invade France, because why not? And so, the thing with Henry, back 400 years, Henry II killed Thomas of Becket, who's now a saint, because of the Rome was bugging him, and the Pope, and there was all these arguments over land use and rights, and there was a big argument, and the king supposedly killed him. Anyway, so this wasn't new, kings arguing with popes, but Henry just kind of took it way further than any other, and he was excommunicated and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Thomas More.
Yes.
He said, when they were writing that letter, he says, Thomas, I'm going to make you a knight. Mm-hmm. Like, Thomas More was really made was knighted, or whatever.
He was made a Sir Thomas More. Yeah, he was.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned, I was talking about More, and like he was, okay, so they were burning the books.
Right.
And I just said, did they really burn the books? And you said, yeah, they really burned the books. And you mentioned that more actually burned people later.
Sure.
What do you mean, sure?
No, I mean, yeah, he did.
Wow.
I mean, but that's what, okay, so here's the thing. When you look at punishments for heresy, the idea of a punishment for heresy was to be burned, and they actually thought that it was merciful at the time. There was a line of thinking that it was merciful because you were able to taste the fires of hell while you were still alive, and that would give you time to repent. So you could repent before you actually died.
What a sweet man.
Well, yeah. So
I get it. It was a different time. I get it. I'm just,
no.
It's crazy that this guy who's like all about God and everything was like burning people to death. It's just, it's a trip to me.
And as gunpowder became more prominent, people would, if you had family and you could get the money, it was a thing that if you had somebody that could do it, it was a gracious thing when you were being burned to have your family put some gunpowder around your neck so that you would explode. It would go faster.
Just shoot me. Please.
So there's like these images when Mary becomes Mary the First and she's killing the Protestants, and Elizabeth also burned killed Catholics as well. There are these images, that I think of in my head of like them being up on the platform and the fires being lit, and and somebody will
exploding.
And somebody will run up and give them gunpowder, and it'll make it go faster.
Just hand it to them fast. Yes, before you. All right. Yeah. So then Charles.
Yes.
Shows up.
Yes.
To the court.
He does.
And they announce him as the Archduke, of among other things, the royal emperor and the Archduke of Austria.
Right.
Like, isn't my geography is really bad? But
yes,
Austria isn't right next to Spain.
No.
What's going on there?
It's because he, from his father's side, inherited the Habsburg Empire. That's how he became the Holy Roman Empire. So his grandfather was Maximilian, and he was of Austria. And then it was through Philip became the King of Spain through his mother, Juana. And then through his father,
because his grandfather married his son to the wife in Spain, and then they had a kid. So it's like consolidating power.
Yes.
And so this guy just had a lot of power.
He wound up getting an awful lot, yes.
And he said something about his chin, and we looked that up, and apparently there's
the Habsburg jaw.
Jaw is like a thing.
Yeah.
So they all had
prominent
big
chins.
There you go. All right. And then I mentioned, I asked you, like, they wouldn't have been speaking English to each other, but you said they probably would have been speaking Latin. Mm-hmm. So I guess if you were to say that, like, Latin was a language spoken, I mean, not necessarily by normal people, but by that was royalty.
And then after that would also be French.
So do you know when, and I don't know if you know this, do you know when people stopped speaking Latin? Because, like, people don't really, I know some people take it in school and stuff, but, like, people don't really speak Latin anymore, right? It's like a dead language. Or
I would guess that it was, I don't know this for a fact, but I would guess that it's as the church stopped having so much power, because that's sort of, I see. Because everything was in Latin for the church. Yeah, like all the Bibles and everything. Exactly. Okay. So once you started getting Bibles in your own languages and things like that, it became less important to speak Latin. All right. Mm-hmm. And then I guess it's just a commentary. Like how weird would it be to be like a grown man, like in your 20s or 30s or whatever, and like meeting your 8-year-old or however, like 6-year-old, 8-year-old wife. Like, that's so weird. I mean, it's like you're burning people alive. I mean, I know this is different things, but it's like hard for me to wrap my head around. Like,
hi, here's your wife. And it's like, oh, you sweet little cute thing. Like, you're going to be my wife. And do you want a piece of candy? Like,
yeah.
It's just so weird.
Yeah.
Like, and like, that's just kind of normal.
Well,
like,
so it wasn't normal in everyday life.
No, I know. But like for royalty and stuff. I mean, which makes it seem even weirder. Like, you'd think you could like marry me to someone close to my own age. But I mean, I know you didn't have a lot of choices because they only had one daughter and just happened to be where people lined up. And like I said, it's better than being married, you know, Margaret or Mary or whoever was married to the old.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'd rather be 8 married to a 25-year-old than a 30-year-old married to an 80-year-old.
But also, I think that this is in
then,
part where the whole idea, like I just talked about with courtly love, came in too, because there wasn't the expectation, especially for royalty and for nobility, that you were going to marry somebody for love. There was the expectation that you would marry for your family, to try and advance your family, to, you know, make good business dealings, get some land. You know, if you were noble, you weren't royal, but if you were minor noble, maybe you marry somebody who has a little bit more land and you get some land.
So where does the courtly love come in?
So the idea is that you weren't going to get that kind of affection in your marriage. You were lucky if you got some friendship, and you know, some people
You're lucky if they were like within 15 years of your age.
Right. And some people even where there were great age differences grew to be very affectionate with each other and have that. But the whole idea of courtly love was, you know, you could play, you could flirt, you could get
that was kind of your love then.
Yeah.
Was like your court. So you would have this person
you would
that
have
you
your
would like
knight
imagine okay,
and
that
he would
kind of makes
serve
sense.
you, and he would, you know,
and that would sort of satisfy your romantic love desire,
right?
And then you're married to some, you know, the neighboring noble's stupid little kid, or whatever.
And so there was this whole kind of second level of flirtation in courts, and that's where you had to really watch it that it didn't get out of hand. And that's what one of Anne Boleyn's problems was, that she had let that kind of get out of hand a little bit too much. And so
it's those eyes,
right? So there was you know, there were certain rules around courtly love, and you could actually even kind of make out with your, you know, and you could kiss, and, you know, you could have this little flirtatious relationship with the people at court and have your courtly love, but there were very strict rules around it. And like, you were never in private with them. And
were they called anything? Were they like if, for example, if you had
my
some
courtly
love out there, like, is he called something? Is he called your knight or your? I mean, there's not like
I think
a
they would just
name.
give each other affectionate.
But there's not a standard.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think there probably were different. I'm not an expert on courtly love, but I think that there were acceptable, because there were a lot of rules around it. That much I do know. I'm
very interested in this courtly love thing. It just sounds, it's just intriguing to me.
No, it is.
Maybe I'll have to read a book or something.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did read a book on boats.
I know you did. You were very intrigued by the Navy.
I was. It's really interesting. Like, just for anyone out there, I'm not a history buff, but the history of ships is to me quite fascinating.
And there's actually a podcast I'm going to give a plug to, the Maritime History Podcast.
Would I like that podcast?
I think you would. It's all about maritime history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Confession: I've never listened regularly to a podcast.
You are in the minority of people.
I know. I mean, I'm making a podcast, and
You've never listened to one.
No, I'm missing out.
You don't have. It's because you have a Windows phone.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know that they have any podcasting apps for you on a Windows phone.
To anyone else out there with Windows phones, you can feel my pain.
Don't get
That's
one.
a good camera, but that's about it. Okay, and then they talked about the Aztec treasures, and
yes,
like that's like real. Like,
yeah.
I know Aztecs are real, but like they already were like sailing to and from the Americas.
Yeah,
like at this time.
Yeah,
and around what years is this all happening again?
1492 was Columbus.
What we're watching.
The story, 1520s.
1520s.
So we're 35 years into it.
It's just blowing my mind that like they were crossing the Atlantic and coming back. Like, yeah. It's like, well, then, but I guess like the Vikings and stuff crossed the Atlantic like
years
in like
before.
1100.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Way before then, even when, I mean, the Viking raids of England were the 9th century. But, you know, interestingly, Henry VII had hired Sebastian Cabot to do a voyage to America. And that was before Henry VIII. That was in the 1490s. So England had tried to get in on it. Henry VII recognized the importance of it. And then Henry VIII didn't really do too much funding of it.
Yeah.
Because he was busy making war with France.
Yeah.
But, and then there was eventually a quest for, they knew that the Northwest Passage wasn't going to work. They tried to do a quest to the Northeast Passage, and they thought that they could go around Russia.
Too far. Yeah.
Yeah. But they wound up finding the White Sea, I guess it is, that goes down into Moscow. And well, one boat froze, and they were actually found by Russian fishermen the next year, and they were all still in place. They think it was actually carbon monoxide poisoning that killed them. But anyway, that was the one boat. But the other boat actually made it down to Moscow, and they started a trading relationship with Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible actually proposed marriage to Queen Elizabeth I. So
that would have been a wild change in history had that gone through.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so there you go. That was English exploration.
That's
pre 15 pre Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake.
Yeah. I've heard those names.
we'll get there. Okay. No, actually we won't in this show.
No. All right. So then Charles, the Spanish king, the Roman emperor, was talking about German mercenaries, and they were fighting, and they planned to take Milan.
Yes.
Like, what? Like, what's that about?
Well, he wound up sacking Rome, like I said, with his German mercenaries, and it was terrible. It was a horrible, horrible thing. Like, it lasted like 5 days, a week, something like that, just with these German mercenaries going insane on Rome and like raping nuns and pillaging and all this kind of stuff. It was really bad. So he was trying to conquer the Italian states.
But wasn't he like their guy? I mean,
well, he was the guy for the Pope. He wasn't the guy for the Italian states.
Okay, because that's like different.
Yeah.
All right.
He wanted to add to his empire.
Yeah. Why not?
If you have German mercenaries at the ready.
Yeah. So I guess it's just commentary or whatever, and we have a difference of opinion.
We do?
Just to me, like that's how dancing kind of was back then, or according to tradition.
Yeah.
Okay, that's like that dancing sucks.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so glad I don't live then and have to dance like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's kind of one of the reasons I feel like I don't like history, because I feel like we got the good stuff now. Yeah. You know, we got the good music, and we got the good dancing and the good food, but it's all in, you know, there's a perspective, I guess, to be had that I'm sort of lacking.
You know, I think it's interesting because, like we talked about with Courtly Love, dancing fell into that vein, and there were all these rules around the steps and, you know, who could dance with who and how you would do it and whatever. And you were supposed to be schooled in that, so that, you know, if you were somebody who was a lady and you were, you know, at court, you were supposed to know all the steps of everything and a pavane and whatever, and so you could step into it. But beneath that, and that's what I think is so interesting about this time, just like with Courtly Love, there were all these rules on the surface, but it was like an iceberg, right? Like underneath all of that, the 90%, what is it? You see 10% of an iceberg and like 90% is underneath. Mm-hmm. So we see those dances that's like the 10% of the surface, and underneath that, the kind of plotting and scheming and drama that would go on, and, you know, just with a simple 4-step dance, like, I don't know. I just think it's interesting that you have all of these rules, but they cover up for so much underneath it.
I like it.
Deep, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then Henry had the dream.
Yes.
About Anne.
Yes.
And she was saying, like, you know, you're in my, you know, you're under my command now, or whatever she said.
Reminded me of like a Calvin Klein perfume ad.
Yeah, right. Running through these halls and stuff. Did he like really write her songs and poems and all that? So they were like really like they had a thing.
Well, yeah, they had a lot of passion, and he did. There's some. Henry actually was a fairly decent composer, so there's music that you
so he wrote her song. It wasn't just like he wrote her like the lyrics to songs.
No,
he wrote her like the
actual
whole song.
Music. Oh my heart and oh my heart. It's like this longing. I'll play some of it for you.
The King gets down,
and and his music. He's no Thomas Tallis.
He was really like, it's not a pun or what. Like, but he was like a Renaissance.
No, he really
man.
was, and he really saw. I mean, and I think that's what's so unfair. And the one thing I do like about the Tudors is that they show. I think they show a little bit more stereotypical Henry in regards to the sex, and that he's humping everybody all the time. But do people still say humping?
We just did.
We just did,
Old
yeah.
people like us.
But, like Henry really, he was smart. I mean, he was raised to be in the church. So he had a really grounded education in classics and in literature. And he composed and he wrote and, he wasn't just a chubby old bearded man who chopped everyone's heads off. No, if he would have died before 1536, I think people would remember him quite differently than we do now. Just the last 10, 12 years of his life were not so good. Yeah. But yeah, he was his compositions he's no Thomas Tallis, but he's better than me. He's kind of like Elvis, like that. I mean, do you think he's living on the moon with Elvis? That took a turn right there. Okay, so we're almost done. All right. Yeah, it's late here. So Brandon, yes. Charles Brandon, yes. The Duke of Norfolk, yeah. And Thomas Boleyn, yes. They all hated Wolsey. Everybody hated Wolsey. And I guess we touched on that earlier, and it's just like he's like this new guy. Well, and even but Brandon's kind of a new guy, but he still doesn't like it because Wolsey's like calling all the shots, and and Wolsey isn't a friend of Brandon's. Yeah. So he's like begrudged towards Wolsey because he has Henry's ear, and like Henry's the one who likes him. Right. So just no one likes Wolsey, and the guy locked up doesn't like Wolsey, and nobody likes Wolsey. And the French don't like Wolsey because he tried to make a deal with them, and the Spanish don't like him because in reality he made another treaty with the French like a week after they did, even though it's different in the story. And so no one likes him. Yeah. Do you think Wolsey even likes Wolsey? I think Wolsey does what he has to do to survive. Yeah. And he's just sort of, scrapping for his... And it served him well because it got him to the point of being a cardinal. But, if he could have been... I think it must have been hard because once, you keep reaching and you're just relying on your wits and your smarts and everything like that. And then you get to be a cardinal and it's almost like you wish you could just rest at that point, but you can't because now it's like a whole nother level of all this responsibility politics you need to navigate. So I think Wolsey might have regretted ever having such ambition. I don't know. Maybe he would have been happier as a butcher, but maybe he wouldn't have had Hampton Court. Yeah, exactly. He had Hampton Court and got to go to Rome and got to wear fancy red outfits. Those red outfits, right? Yep. Yep. Silly hats. Yep. All right. Well, those are my questions. So, do you want to move on to your themes? No, there's only kind of two in this episode, which is just the sort of changing face of diplomacy. There was this strange relationship that continued throughout the 16th century between England, France, and the emperor, and Spain, and it was like these three kind of powers, and the other people played, the Low Countries and Italy and different places would play parts, but it was this triangle of who was going to be the balancing against the other one, and this we kind of saw how fluid those relationships could be, and so that was kind of something that really happened and was a part of 16th century life for Henry. And then also the relationship that Catherine and her nephew Charles would have, and how loyal Charles actually was to his aunt. And, he had self-serving reasons as well, but how that would make Henry's divorce very difficult for him once it came time. Because, see, the emperor sacks Rome and has the Pope in his hand, and then Henry comes asking for a divorce from the emperor's aunt, and he's not going to be too happy about that. So there's that coming. And then also Anne and Henry's relationship, they did meet at the Mask. And this early on, there's not a whole lot that that hints at what's going to come with them. And so a lot of this is dramatic license looking back at it through hindsight, but it was a very passionate relationship. And so, you know, it could have gone.
It could have been.
He might have had dreams of hallways and stuff like that. So, yeah.
And I like that. I feel like they got the memo, the people making the show, that there was a lack of skin.
Of girl skin.
In the second week, yeah.
Yeah, I know you were disappointed about that.
They rectified things.
They took care of that.
This episode.
I'm really glad that keeps a level of interest for you.
Yeah, I think it helps for the guys. I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
You know, I think a lot of the straight guys are being forced to watch this by their wives, and so they have to throw something in to keep them happy.
There you go.
See, they should do the same with, like, sports and car races.
See, that's what they need in sports. See, you know, instead of girl cheerleaders, like, the guys already have the sports to look at.
Right.
So what they need is like hot, scantily clad men cheerleaders to keep the women entertained.
I would totally watch.
See, we got to try and sell this to like one of the big sporting people.
I don't think can you see Roger Goodell or like any of the football team owners having any interest in that?
Like tough football fans, what they would have to say about that idea. I don't think it would go over too well.
I don't think it would go over.
It wouldn't help the slumping ratings.
No. Are there okay. I'm
sorry.
That's okay.
Left turn.
All right. So thanks again for listening to our podcast, and we hope you like it. And so you can learn more about us and get more information on watchingthetudors.com. That's us. And also, again, just leave us a rating on iTunes if you like the show. And we will talk to you again next week.
We'll talk to you later. Bye.